Oh, here we go. Buddy, he's fabulous at this. Well done, Liam. And welcome to Pride Talks Back. My name is William Crawley. It's great to be in Common Market. Isn't Common Market fabulous? It's absolutely lovely space. It's just it's part of the kind of renaissance that's happening in this part of Belfast. And it's absolutely lovely, especially on a Saturday or a Sunday. Come down here, and all these vendors are open, and you're going to having all kinds of street food and drinks and everything. It's really fabulous, but not nearly as fabulous as this queer expression of gorgeousness that we have in front of us. So welcome to all of you, whether you're gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, questioning, queer, straight. There must be some straight people here. You're welcome. Everybody is welcome here. We've got a big table and we're going to have a conversation together about what it means to be queer in this society and the ways in which we can benefit from services, particularly in our society. So we want you to take part. It's not a listening experience, it's a talking experience. So at some point in the evening, you will feel like you want to take part, and you can raise a hand. Let's try that right now, in fact, to prove you can do it. Go on, break out of yourself. Go on, yes? Yeah? Oh, you're going to be difficult, are you? Come on. Yeah, come on, that's it. At some point, you can do that at any point, and I'll know that you want to come in, and I'll try to get to you. Let me introduce you to this terrific panel of expertise we have on the stage with me. Simon Byrne, in the middle, is the Chief Constable of the PSNI. We have Geraldine McGahey, the Chief Commissioner for the Equality Commission. We have next to Geraldine, Margaret Kelly, the Northern Ireland Public Services Ombudsman. And we have Deirdre Hargey over here, our Communities Minister, and Alyson Kilpatrick, who's a barrister and the Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission. Welcome them all to Pride Talks Back. So I have some questions. I have some questions which have come from you and which have come from the queer community more generally, and some people here will be asking questions as well, along with your follow-up. First question to all of our panelists tonight is, looking at your own organization or looking at the sector you work in, do you think you have a problem with institutional homophobia or institutional transphobia? Simon, why don't you start for us? In your organization, welcome.
Well, thank you, and thanks for letting me have an audience tonight and to sort of take some questions and listen. I think it's a really good place to start, because the whole issue of institutional bias in a whole range of things, whether it's, you'll see a big debate in policing at the moment about institutional racism. I don't think that we are institutionally homophobic or transphobic, but I do think we've probably got more to do in terms of understanding the impact of policy practice on how we deliver service. So part of tonight's agenda is to listen. We've got colleagues in the room, and we've got to be in a place really, as society around us is changing, we're so much fleet of foot to change with it. So that, I think definitely we'll probably hear some questions and concerns today where we need to do better, but we've also got good news. I mean, our recruiting figures have nearly doubled in a decade. And we'll maybe touch on that later. And we're actually resolving, for example, more homophobic crime than we've ever done. So there's a mixed picture of things we're doing well and things we need to get better at.
This is in the context where the PSNI stats branch this year revealed new figures about homophobia, transphobia, the highest figures since you started keeping records back in 2004 or thereabout. How do you explain that? Is that people coming forward more or an increase in the crimes per capita?
Well, again, I'd be interested to hear from the audience as the evening develops, but I think in some senses, it's any time you get a rise in crime, you'll hear a police leader say it's because people have more confidence, that the systems and processes are better. So whether it's reporting stuff to us directly or through the advocacy service, But then other people will say it's not just because of that, it's because actually of a true rise in crime. And I suppose the truth lies somewhere in the middle. I think we've redoubled our efforts in recent years to be accessible and available to people right across the community. Our investment in neighbourhood policing, I think it's paid real dividends. But again, people's experiences of contacting the police, I imagine, will be variable.
Geraldine, you work in equality, obviously, and you have your own metrics, don't you? People come to you with their experiences.
They do.
How do you sense where you are in your sector?
We sense that hate crime, homophobia is underreported. Of all of the complaints and inquiries that we get to our advice line, only about 2% of those are related to transgender or homophobic issues. So we fear that there's a great underreporting, and I think many reports have shown that there is. I think the Rainbow Project highlighted that maybe 68% of people who have been a victim don't report it. So in terms of the stats going up, I think it's only 1 year. I think we need to see more, to see a trend, to see whether or not it's really happening or whether it's a blip in the system. But I think there have been a lot of effort put in by a lot of people, a lot of organisations to support victims of crime, to be able to encourage them to come out and speak up and make their case. But we constantly tell people, if you have been a victim, if you have suffered discrimination, or indeed if you know someone who may have been discriminated against because of their sexual orientation, etc., speak up, don't suffer in silence, let us help.
If you think there is an issue of underreporting, what's your best guess at explaining that? Is it that people who have experienced homophobic or transphobic crime are nervous about going to the police or to some of the other sectors to report? Why are they nervous?
I think they're nervous for a number of reasons. I think there's a fear of criticism, a fear of being further ostracised, a fear of inviting more crime, a fear or a belief that it maybe isn't going to be investigated properly. What will be the sanction placed on people who carry out the crime or make their lives miserable? So I think it's all of those issues brought together, and I think the support services that are being established now help people believe that they will be listened to and that someone will take action. But until hate crime legislation is really amended and the various sanctions are laid very clear as to what will be the outcome of hate crime, I don't think we're going to get a true reflection.
And Deirdre, we sometimes use this expression, institutional homophobia or transphobia. We could say societal homophobia or transphobia as well, which may be a barrier for people who want to. And look, let's be honest, the LGBT community has made strides forward in recent years, mostly because of the campaigners within the LGBT community. But we have a problem, a big problem, and politics is part of that problem.
No, I think definitely. I mean, when you look at the history of, I suppose, this state and the states right across the island, I mean, they were ultra-conservative in their form. They were religious in their formation in terms of the development of social policy, and that was restricted. There was persecution, there was inequality, and the remnants of that still exist, and there's still systemic things that we need to change. And I think that that's something that has been consistently raised by a variety of communities, our LGBTQI plus community, our women's movement, our language speaking community as well, in terms of those systemic inequalities that still exist. And of course, a part of that is driven by politics, there's no doubt about that. We're nearly 25 years into a peace agreement where a Bill of Rights was promised and still has not been delivered upon. So it's issues like this in terms of really bringing equality to the fore, in terms of not shying away to say that there are systemic issues there that we need to deal with. We need to acknowledge that there is systemic issues, the history of where these things have come from, but importantly, how we're going to challenge and rectify that going forward. And I think that that's where the urgency and the focus needs to be, and should have been over the last 25 years.
And when you look at those strides forward, the most recent of which was, we had same-sex marriage that came through Westminster. We've had every single move has come from somewhere other than Stormont.
It came from activism at the grassroots.
But Stormont legislators haven't done it, right? Stormont has absolutely failed the LGBT community, hasn't it?
Well, that's because there is, again, a political viewpoint or a certain section of the politics within Stormont, or whether that's a local government as well, that are against rights equality legislation coming forward, and in a way that our community want to see it come forward. People voted overwhelmingly for the Good Friday Agreement, and within that for a Bill of Rights to be agreed that would start to embed these rights within all parts of our society and within all structures of the institutions that make up that society, including the government. That has not been lived up to, and in fact it's actually been continually blocked, and that's what we need to challenge, is that continuous blockage. Where we need to find ways to work around and overcome that blockage, then of course we'll do that, and we have seen that in recent events that have happened around legislation, and indeed the LGBTQI+ community have done that also. That is regrettable, because politics has to be seen to be working. But we do need to deliver on those international commitments in terms of human rights and equality. And we are in a concerning picture at the moment where you can see this current Tory government are actually trying to erode and to roll back on the instruments of the Good Friday Agreement around the European Convention of Human Rights, and in fact probably trying to erode back on the principle of having devolved settlements and administrations right across all of the jurisdictions. And I think, you know, there needs to be a watchful eye as we're moving forward, and now more than ever we need that activism, that collectivism, that community organising taking place probably at a greater scale than what we've seen before.
I hear what you're saying, but your party, Sinn Féin, doesn't have a single LGBT elected representative.
Well, we try to reach out.
The DUP, even the DUP has one.
Well, we have had LGBT representatives coming forward, and in going through selection, we do try to reach out far and wide to make sure the party is representative.
But that must be troubling for you, given what you've just said, Deirdre, that you don't have a single elected LGBT representative?
Well, there may not be a single one who has come out in terms of being LGBTQI+. There's work that's still to be done in making sure representation is across the board. But we are clearly a party based on equality, based on rights for all of our citizens. And of course, visibility is an important part of that.
It is.
And there's work that we will continue to strive to do. So I'm not going to sit here and say that we're completely 100% perfect. We're not. There's more work that we need to do, and we want to do that along with others, both within politics but also within grassroots movements, to ensure that in all aspects of our society and life, that our communities are represented and reflected, and that they feel that.
Alyson, when it comes to human rights, give us your sense. You know how human rights works across Europe, different parts of the world in terms of LGBT rights. How does this place compare, and how does it compare in terms of homophobia and transphobia?
It doesn't actually compare too badly if you take the whole of Europe, but you're comparing it with places which are openly transphobic and openly homophobic and actually make laws to make sure of that. So, it's a low bar you're comparing yourself against. But when just listening to everybody else, what they feel about their own organisations, I think our organisation has also failed. We're a human rights organisation, and we tell ourselves that because we're for human rights, we can't be homophobic or transphobic. And that is to fundamentally misunderstand transphobia and homophobia, in my view. Because there are a lot of people who are human rights champions who also are transphobic and homophobic. And I'm seeing that even within the human rights sector. So as much as I'd love to say, no, of course we're not, we must be, of course we are. And I think to deny it is probably to say I'm ignoring the issue and missing the issue. Where do you see it in your organisation? I see it everywhere. In your organisation? I see it everywhere with other organisations. I see it less so in ours, thankfully, because we're very careful. I've got a very watchful eye on it, but I do see it. It can be an afterthought if we're doing a piece of advice on legislation. Somebody will say, have we actually thought about what this means for LGBTQ? And we say, actually, no, we haven't. That should not be the case. We should have this through everything we do, but we don't. Also, in discussions on the board of the Commission, we have conversations that I'm not entirely comfortable about. So unless I can recognise that in my own pro-human rights organisation...
Well, what kind of things are being said at your board?
Well, so things that I don't welcome, that aren't entirely supportive,
board
that are
members.
Questioning of... No, I didn't say that, not necessarily. But questioning of homophobia, transphobia, conversion therapy. We have debates about things like that. Mm-hmm. And there will be a difference in views. Now, I find a difference in views to be problematic I know it's welcome to have different views, but I think if you're a pro-human rights organisation, then you have to be for human rights.
Well,
And people have human rights whether they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or anything else.
that's very honest. Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Margaret. In your world, I mean, the Public Services Ombudsman, people come to you when they feel like they're being failed in our public services, and one of the ways in which they're failed is homophobia and transphobia.
Absolutely. And I think the Public Services Ombudsman's office is on a journey with those issues. And I think that often what we've done is maybe take an approach that has been to be blind, so to say we're open to everybody, anybody can come to us, we're available. And in the last year, we've been looking quite carefully at that. And we have said, actually, we did a public awareness survey, and it is clear to us that there are particular sections of the public that don't know what we do, that don't know when they should come to us, that are unaware of when we might be able to be helpful. And one of those sections of the public are people from the LGBTQ community. And so we have started a very deliberate programme of reaching out to say, this is what we do, and if you have particular difficulty, journey for us internally and externally. So I would not sit here and say, actually, we have cracked that, because I don't think we have, and I think we are on the early steps of that journey. And we are like every other organisation, sometimes we get it wrong. So part of the reason that when I was invited, that I was actually really quite keen to come and be part of this is to talk about what we do, is perhaps to have that opportunity to engage with people and to have a bit of discussion about when the office might actually be helpful. Because I think it is one thing to talk about homophobia, but actually that can also mean being blind and not recognising when you need to take action. And sometimes when I'm asked to describe what the Ombudsman's office is, I say it's an advocate for fairness. So we're about fairness, but actually, unless you reach out and address those barriers, people can't get fairness.
Just in case you're inundated with new work, you're kind of a court of final appeal, though, aren't you? You have to, if someone has a problem with the way they've been treated or mistreated in services,
so
you've got to work through those organisations first before they get to you, right?
In most cases, they need to go through the organisation's complaint process first, give them an opportunity to put it right, which is right and proper. And if they remain unhappy, then they can come to us. And of course, if they remain unhappy with me, they can go to judicial review. But I have to say, when we get those complaints, spend a lot of time investigating, taking, I think, a very fair view. And part of what I see my role as doing is helping those public services make those changes. So it's not just about the individual complaint, which is really important. It's about those bigger, broader changes that I think we need to make.
To change the culture. Have you, as yet, upheld any complaints about homophobia and transphobia?
So it depends how that comes. So a complaint of homophobia as such wouldn't come to me, but it would. So what I would do is look at the process by which perhaps someone had or had not got a service, or how they have been treated in a service, and what I look at is maladministration. So have people followed their own process? Have people been treated with fairness and respect? So we haven't upheld it in that way. And that is, I think, it's why I say to you, I think the office is on a journey with this community and with lots of others. Right. I get a 7-year term. I've done nearly 2. My aim in the next 5 years is to leave an office that's more modern and more inclusive and more relevant.
And maybe you'll need better metrics.
I hope.
If you're not picking up homophobia and transphobia directly, because it's there, clearly it's there.
We don't keep that data, and that is something
maybe
to
you're not looking for it in the right places. Anybody want to pick up on where we are on homophobia, transphobia in this society, in different sectors, in different organizations? We've got microphones all around the room. We've got a hand over here. We can alternate if there's a hand over here in a second, but let's come to you first of all, straight away. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sean Kelly. I sit on the Equality Committee for the INTO. We're a trade union that supports teachers here. And within the last 12 months, we've experienced, well, I suppose the lived experience of teachers who identify with either same-sex attraction or non-binary gender, or indeed are just questioning. And we've had reports from them of homophobia within the school setting from both students and staff. We've had queries from them still. These have been coming in year on year from teachers saying, should they actually come out in the workplace due to fear of not getting their temporary contract renewed, for example. As well as that, we've had our own social media presence inundated by internet trolls, so much so we've had to update our security protocol from far-right trolls with homophobia, transphobia, biphobia, etc. So these things are happening in a public setting, in school environments, and there's very little scope for what these teachers can actually achieve. Some of them are happy. Some of them are happy with the outcomes that we present to them. Others try to take it further and don't get anywhere. So if I could sort of ask a quality committee or quality commission person there for some support there, would be nice.
Have you gone to the Equality Commission at all?
Some of our members have gone to the Equality Commission, yes, and have had very limited success because schools do fall outside of the Section 75 equality legislation and the Good Friday Agreement. And until we can get that ethos clause removed from schools, our members are going to be faced with the same homophobia and transphobia year on year.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you. We have had some cases come to us where they are in the system at the moment. I don't have that information to hand. But however, having said that, teacher exception from the Fair Employment Treatment Order, this private members bill has gone through, and that's now being changed, and that's to do with the recruitment of teachers on the basis of their religion. Everybody in our society should be treated equally, regardless of the setting. And if anyone is being harassed or bullied because of their sexual orientation, we would like to help. We would like those people to come to us and explain what's happening, because the Fair Employment and Treatment Order only applies to the recruitment of teachers, not in terms of how they are sustained in their employment and how they're bullied or harassed. So that information, we would like to talk to you further about that. Please get your colleagues to come and speak to some of the advice officers in the Equality Commission, because it's wholly inappropriate that in today's society anyone should be bullied or harassed because of their sexual orientation. And the law does not prohibit that, it does not support it. It's actually illegal to bully and harass someone because of their sexual orientation. So I think it's an important issue, and we certainly will do everything we can to help.
Simon, do you want to pick up on what's happening on social media in terms of the trolling and the abuse? It's very difficult for the police to even access information at times. Those of us who have been trolled, I've had the police at my house, other journalists have too, and there's only so much that can be done with Twitter and organizations like that. So people can feel very abandoned in that experience.
Yeah, it is a fair point, and maybe one that we'll return to throughout the evening, really, that there is sometimes a frustration that the law can get complicated, to say the least. So there's stuff that's overtly a hate crime and happens in a way that we can investigate and prosecute within this jurisdiction, but it will be no surprise to many people that we get problems sometimes with third-party providers, but also that if you're trolling somebody and your server's based in another part of the world, it makes obtaining the evidence to get through to prosecution difficult. But also, you only have to follow the public discourse, whether it's issues like this or broader afield, the sheer hurt and heartache that goes when you are bombarded often with quite offensive image, language, and so on and so forth. And our dilemma really often is to show support where we're involved, to explain as candid as we can where thresholds are, because again, as I say, it gets complicated, and we get in this grey area between what might be absolutely offensive to somebody, but doesn't pass the test to make it a crime. So I think, obviously, there's a broader debate about hate crime legislation, and we'll see where that goes when we...
and harassment, this continuing bombardment of abuse. It may not be a hate crime, but harassment is protected under you're protected from harassment, aren't you?
Yes, I mean, there's a whole range of things that will happen to people, both as institutions in different relationships. So my encouragement really, we might not always be able to solve the problem, but if you are experiencing something that is troubling, upsetting, or you believe is criminal, is to ring us on 101 or speak to your neighbourhood policing team. At least we can work with you to understand the issue. Where we can bring cases to prosecution, we will. And where we can encourage others to desist, we will.
There's an aspect here for legislators as well, of course, Stormont. When it comes to the protection of teachers, do you think laws need to be changed, more laws need to be changed to give more protection to LGBTQ teachers?
I think there's no doubt. I mean, some of our legislation is out of date and it needs upgraded. And I think that is the case in terms of the hate crime legislation. And we can see that even with our minority ethnic community in terms of hate crime as well. And I think another part, and this has been picked up on some of the social inclusion strategies, but it's even how data is collected or how hate crime is recorded, and the different areas that that's then used or categorised. And it's one of the examples CAJ, for example, has raised in a recent report as well. So I know Naomi Long, the Justice Minister, is obviously looking at that at the moment, and I imagine it'll be one of the key pieces of legislation that will be brought forward, but there's definitely more that needs to be done as we start to emerge and ensuring that we are building a rights-based approach at the heart of government to make sure that a programme for government, but that's not to be naive and say that there are people who are elected within that institution that would be completely opposed to these types of additional protections or types of legislation. So again, the work will need to be done to ensure that we do get that legislation passed. But what does give me hope in the last mandate, the progressive legislation that was passed in that shortened mandate gives me hope that we can follow through and getting the Assembly up and running and getting more progressive legislation put through.
I want to come back, if I could. I think schools have an ideal opportunity at the moment with the anti-bullying legislation that came into effect last September. I think if schools are serious about complying with their requirements under the law in terms of dealing with bullying in schools, and that was the bullying, it was designed to deal with the bullying of pupils, both against the pupil and by pupils. So teachers are suffering bullying by the pupils, then surely if the school is fulfilling its obligations and monitoring and addressing the issue, then it should too address the issue of bullying of its staff. It should be compiling the data, it should be giving leadership to pupils.
It may be the school that's doing the bullying.
Absolutely, and how can you give
Maybe
leadership?
the headmaster or the principal who's doing the bullying.
The Board of Governors.
Yes,
and
how, have a particularly religious ethos school, for example, where they don't want gay teachers.
Well, I would say that they would say that that's not the way they operate in their school, but the legislation now requires them to give leadership to make sure that there is no bullying. So how can you give leadership if not by example of how you behave yourself? And if teachers are being bullied by boards of governors, by principals, by senior staff, then that needs to be called out and it needs to be made an example of, because that is what the legislation is there to address.
Go ahead.
So schools came within the Ombudsman jurisdiction in 2018, and I've seen the number of complaints that come in about schools rocket. I don't deal with employment issues at all, so that will be where there will have been a pupil and a parent will have complained. And I see such a diversity of response in those schools with really good principals and really strong boards of governors. They see complaints as an opportunity to learn and change. But I actually do see in the complaints that come through, and I've done a number of thematic reports with more to go on particular issues, where some schools have not had that culture change. Schools see complaints and pupils or parents complaining as something really difficult and to be brushed under the carpet. And I do think there's a responsibility around the Department of Education, both in terms of principal training, but also Board of Governor training, around their responsibility to really look at complaints and to change that culture in schools. We have seen those numbers increase, and I expect to continue to see them increase. So it's not the employment bit, because that is not my bit, but in terms of the whole school culture, there's definitely work to do.
Alyson.
Yeah, I just want to share some information with you. The Commission has launched an investigation into relationships and sexuality education in post-primary schools. We'd love to hear from you. We're taking evidence. We can compel. We're actually exercising a statutory function to investigate, and we've compelled provision of information in relation to it. But the point you raise is something we could have overlooked otherwise. I'd be really interested in hearing from you at the Commission and anybody else who has something they could offer in relation to education, because we've identified the problem and we want to know to what extent the education that's what's being taught to children and who's delivering the training.
What is the status of perhaps a fundamentalist Christian group who might come into a primary school or a secondary school, invited in by the headmaster or the principal, and they deliver some kind of program which most people in this room would regard as transphobic or homophobic? What is the status and how can that be permissible?
Well, that's what we're investigating.
But it's legal, is it?
Well, it's not illegal. Can I put it that way? At the minute, we're looking at it. We're trying to identify the scale of the problem. And
do you think that should be illegal?
It is happening.
It is happening, yeah.
It is. It shouldn't be happening. It's within the gift of the department, and also.
So the department could shut it down, but it's not illegal.
The department is responsible for who educates the children in Northern Ireland. There's a fixation in Northern Ireland that only the parents can decide what children get taught, and this is one of those areas. So we will have to bring out a report.
Interesting.
Due course.
Follow-up questions. We've got a mic over here for Vince Creelan. Got a follow-up question from you, Vince. Got some other named follow-up questions, but if you haven't given us your name, you can ask a question too. Please do. Vince.
If I could just say initially, I'm already disappointed by what sounds like disingenuous, tired responses. We know what, you know apparently as well what you could, you should, you must do, but we're hearing, we know there's more to be done. We hear this year after year after year, and whether it's education, whether it's guidance, toothless regulations, or whether it's ACPO that can't even use the word institutional when it talks about racism, but it says it's kind of widespread, it's just not acceptable. But anyway, my question is, bearing in mind the raft of apologies from the PSNI and disclosure of statistics relating to police culture and lack of professionalism, much like the Met, is it time for the PSNI to be put into special measures?
Is it time for the PSNI to go into special measures? Simon.
Thanks. No, I don't think it is, frankly, because, I mean, clearly there's been concern recently about a particular case, which, as you'll appreciate, that it's a live criminal case, so that I can't really go into details of those allegations. You'll see across policing, both in the UK and Europe at the moment, actually, when you look at some of the research about how police officers and police staff are using social media to express views that no one would say reflect a modern organisation. If you look at the mechanics, though, of what special measures means for an organisation, there's actually far more at play in terms of failings and missed chances to improve than just dealing with an isolated issue like you described. So, for example, the Met case would look at failings in leadership, failings in practice, failings in how performance in the round is managed. If you look at the last time, I think they did audits of how crime was recorded, how calls were taken. So there's a whole range of organisational and institutional proceedings that if effectively the police watchdog, the Home Office sort of commission, which is quite a mouthful in terms of Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services, they're the arbiter of who goes into that process. And you would, as a Chief Constable, you wouldn't be finding out in the evening news that was happening. So you'd have been engaged for some time with, if you like, red flags and warnings that this is an issue. You need to address it to our satisfaction, and only if you don't, you go into an escalation process. So I think we're way, way off that now, because in fairness, in a big organisation, there are sometimes things we will do really well and sometimes things we have to improve. But broadly, our standards of service are strong. We're the third safest place in the UK. Last year was the safest year for 50 years in terms of some of the work we're doing to reduce the risk of terrorism and paramilitary crime, and we're seizing records amounts of drugs from across the street. Now, I know that doesn't drift into some of the issues at play today, but organisationally, I think we're making real progress.
I appreciate that. There's also stats that 130 officers are now being investigated for gross misconduct. You referred to the WhatsApp group, 20 officers, misogynistic, racist, xenophobic language. I know you're not excusing it, but it's a fact. The police aren't, it came up the policing board that you have a lot of drivers who can't respond to emergency calls because they're not trained to drive. 34% increase in homophobic hate crime. a clearance rate of what, 20% is it? So 80% of crime. Then you've got not just crimes, you've got where things can be reported, but it's just taken as an incident. So you have this other caveat, this get out of jail free card, where far more incidents are reported but are not investigated. And it's that type of thing which, for the community here that you're answering to, I know you can talk about international stuff and you talk about drugs. That's what we're thinking about today, and say, why is that not as a policy? You used to have independent advisory groups for the Chief Constable, policing, strategic reference groups for the policing board. Those have been done away with. I understand requests have been made to reconstitute those, but for some reason the police is resistant to that. You're only going to get real engagement. You're only going to get some of the hard questions that you need to answer if you're going to engage the community on that level, and you're not doing that.
Well, I think, again, I'd be interested to see from people's experience, but there are some things I wouldn't say is entirely accurate there. We do have an independent advisory group. There are members from the LGBT community on that advisory group. I've met them myself regularly. We've just launched a new community engagement strategy here for you, which sets out the framework we expect from the organisation itself, but also the local districts, about how they sort of understand and talk to local communities. In terms of, again, we can get into some sort of quite, I don't mean to be pejorative, but sort of anodyne descriptions about what an incident and what a crime is. Yes, it is a fact, but we comply with two national standards. One is the National Standard of Incident Recording, and one's the National Crime Recording Standard. And they are sort of gateways that push us down different routes. Just because you're involved in an incident doesn't mean we won't investigate something. It just means we won't investigate something to a likely criminal conclusion. And whilst you talk, again, in terms of outcome rates, which in old language is how many crimes we detect, whilst, yes, absolutely, there's always more to do, but the levels that you're describing, many chiefs in England and Wales would be proud of those levels. That 80% missing is still more than we'd like, but if you see the national debate at the moment about levels of crime that's solved by the police in England and Wales, we far outperform them. So that we have to respect the fact that there's officers day and daily are dealing with difficult situations and bringing people to book. And then I think if there's one thing I'd like to see is the criminal justice system speeding up, so that the people that are witnesses or victims have more confidence there's a quicker resolution to their problem.
Simon, do you think the LGBT community in Northern Ireland trusts you?
I imagine it's variable. I have, for example, I have a good working relationship with our network that operates internally, and I think that's a big opportunity to give me a voice, both into the organisation, because obviously we reflect communities, we're part of the community, but also to give me advice and other senior colleagues about where we need to go next. I think we've got an ambition to be really quite progressive in this space and move. The debate hasn't really got into it today, but for example, in many different characteristics in Northern Ireland, we'll talk about how representative an organisation is. Well, I think we can show increasingly we are in terms of this particular dynamic, but you also need to be inclusive, which means the way the environment treats you in the workplace, values people's identity and difference, and we're working hard at that. And similarly, and more manifestly, it's just the standard of service that you get, regardless of your background, your sexual orientation, etc., when you pick up the phone, when you walk into a police station, or when an officer turns up at your home to deal with a crime. And I think we're looking simply at how we get, to use your phrase earlier, better metrics and better insights.
Well, I'm just wondering what the metrics might. I love metrics, obviously, but if you're trying to measure the trust that a particular audience has in your organisation or a community, you don't do opinion polls, I assume. How would you try to work out what the LGBT community thinks of the police, whether they trust the police?
Yeah, well, there's a few things we can do, and again, I'll be interested in views. And
a show of hands in a second.
So, and as Deirdre said, some of this also links to other stuff that either the institutions of Stormont or the executive itself can help with. So many of you follow policing over the years, and obviously Alyson has her own sort of advisory history from the past, but we used to have a national sort of confidence survey that the Department of Justice ran, which would give you quite sort of broad and granular information about trust and confidence in policing. That was scrapped a few years ago. I'd really like to see that come back, because not only does it help people hold me to account, but it gives me insight about where we are not succeeding, because generally people will be suspicious of marking your own homework. So I think there's stuff like that. We talked before in the school setting about monitoring sort of levels of complaint, either that we will see personally or through the Ombudsman, how we look at workplace issues around grievance, industrial tribunals, etc. So there are signs and symbols. And equally, I think one of the biggest barometers that we can use across the piece to look at how well we are doing as a service is victim satisfaction levels, because in anybody's parlance, if you equate that with how business works, that's the amount of sort of confidence you will have that when you experience ringing us, seeing us turn up, seeing a case through conclusion, where we meet the mark. And we do recognize that some of you in the room might be victims in crime, and I don't want anyone to do a show of hands, but equally we recognize, for example, what we call follow-up, i.e. keeping you abreast of where your case is up to. We need to do better.
Well, it's not scientific, it's not a scientific survey, but let me ask this audience. Do you have trust and confidence in the PSNI as members of the queer community, the LGBT community in Northern Ireland? Put your hand up if you do have trust and confidence in the PSNI. A bit higher so we can see them. Good. So that's about 20 people or so in this audience. Put your hand up if you do not have trust and confidence in the PSNI. That's a similar number of people. And the rest of you, the jury's out. Is that fair? The jury's out. So that's what we're working with, just in this room, not scientific, of course. Let's go to another question. The question is from Sarah Jordan. Where are you, Sarah? Sarah's in the room, right here. Hi, Sarah. We'll get a mic to you. Here we go.
What provisions are going to be made for healthcare for trans youth, considering there's been nothing for 2 years?
Let me come to you first, Deirdre, on this as the politician on the panel. Obviously, there are many, practically every trans person you'll speak to here will say they feel abandoned or forgotten by our healthcare system. We have a healthcare waiting list crisis. Try getting a hip replacement. You know, if you think that's bad, try getting gender surgery of one kind or another. Almost impossible here. Is it fair to say the trans community has been forgotten by our healthcare system?
I think we do, as you noted, have a healthcare system in crisis, but there's no doubt. I had met recently with a constituent who wanted to be referred to a clinic, and they have an appointment that they were saying given a time scale of 5 years. And obviously that is totally in group, and indeed the expert panel report for the LGBTQI plus strategy, and indeed healthcare is one of the main areas of that emergent strategy that's coming forward. So as part of my departmental responsibility in terms of bringing that social inclusion strategy forward, we have been engaging with officials within the Health Trust in terms of making a prioritisation of healthcare needs for trans people, but obviously for the LGBT community more broadly. It is one of the biggest areas in that strategy when you look at it. Healthcare issues is one of the most critical issues. And there's no doubt there is a failure at the minute. I mean, I would be lying to sit here and say there would be something else. There may be a resistance in terms of the issues as well, and that's why we do need the strategy to come forward. We need robust legislation that protects people and gives them their basic rights, and none other than the basic right to access to healthcare at the point of need, and to make sure that that's delivered on their behalf. So it has to be one of the areas, as I say, it will be coming forward in the emerging LGBTQI plus strategy. We're co-designing that at the moment with the community, but also with the other government departments. And I would like to see that strategy formally presented to the incoming executive, if that can be formed, coming in here in the autumn, that strategy will be ready to be presented then to go out to full public consultation. But I think there are things that health could be doing now in terms of having that engagement, in terms of looking at the waiting list issue, for example, and the additional investment that was being earmarked for the health service of up to £1 billion, is to make sure that we're equality proofing and screening that budget going forward. And I think that's where some of the conversation will have to be focused while the strategy starts to be embedded over the next period.
Given the history, as we were talking about earlier, of Stormont and LGBTQ policies and laws, you can't have any confidence, surely, that you're going to get any trans health legislation through Stormont, right? You're going to have to go to Westminster for that, aren't you?
Well, I think it should be
like
delivered.
everything else?
I think it should be delivered at Stormont.
It's not going to happen, Deirdre, is
I
it?
think what the election showed there back in May was that people want to see change. They want to see delivery. They want to see delivery on the issue of rights. And trans rights is critical in terms of that overall rights package. So there's a responsibility on us. We've been elected to deliver on legislation, and we need to be bringing that robust legislation forward, and that needs to happen within the next mandate. The key now is getting the institutions up and running.
Margaret, we have all kinds of rights on paper that don't translate into the real world. Lots of great rights on paper for LGBTQ people don't translate into the real world. Do you have any say in your organization over healthcare services and what's happening with young trans people or all trans people or non-binary people?
So we work in two ways. Individual people bring an individual complaint, and I look at, can I deal with that complaint within the terms of my legislation? And if I can, then we look at, is it proportionate and in the public interest to do it? But I also have a different power, which is a power of own initiative, which means that if I have a reasonable suspicion that there is systemic maladministration, then I can have an investigation. I have a very small team of people that do that for me. You're talking 4 people. But the issue around access to gender identity services for both young people and adults has come through as part of a broader piece of work that we're doing on looking at waiting lists. And that I have to be honest and say that my team have done the initial scoping for that investigation, and I have read that and actually found it fairly shocking, to be honest.
What's the most shocking part of it?
For me, people waiting 5 years before an appointment, focus that is mental health related rather than primary care, people going for access to private health care and then not getting the support they need, young people suffering huge mental health issues without actually being able to access the support. So my team have done me the first scoping part of that. I have very particular processes in terms of my legislation that I have to do, but we have done the first part of that. That is fairly shocking. I know that the Trust have done a review. My understanding is that that has not yet been published, and we're certainly asking questions about the publication, but looking at a bigger investigation around that is on my agenda, and I think something we really do need to look at, quite possibly something that we might need to coordinate across a couple of agencies.
Alyson?
Yeah, I promise to be honest tonight when you ask questions, and I'm going to stick with that. The situation is not just that trans people have been overlooked, it's that they are actively provided against. So in relation to gender recognition certificates, for example, there was one doctor prepared to sign a certificate and they had to be paid for it. That doctor then stopped doing the reports. People weren't being referred to Tavistock. People were being referred to Tavistock and then having their surgery cancelled. They were having the start of their surgery completed and then left to have the rest of the surgery done maybe 2 years later and suffering all sorts of problems in between. This is not just a situation where we need laws. This is brutal, it is discriminatory, and it is through the whole, from the child presents right through schooling, through gender recognition, through transition, if that's what somebody wants. The idea that we just need some legislation is fanciful, because the culture is not there. It is actively blocked. And I've looked very closely at a lot of the trans provision and the trans services, and it is shocking. And we can't get away from it. We can't tinker around the edges with this and recommend legislation. There's got to be a fundamental acceptance that this is not something unusual, that it is a healthcare issue and it's something people are entitled to expect. And instead, it's the first thing that goes every time. It's almost hand behind the back, and we'll maybe give some services or some resources up at Knockbracken, for example. Till we change that, nothing's going to improve.
On the gender recognition certificate, I mean, there's a number of people obviously are concerned about. Do you support self-declaration, self-ID as they've done in the Republic in 2015 as the way of moving forward on that?
Not necessarily exactly as they've done it in the Republic, but yes, it has to change. It has to move away from medicalisation of it. definitely. And I don't think there's much argument anymore that the way we do it here it's discriminatory, it's brutalizing, it's horribly uncomfortable for people, and it's unfair.
I think going back to the original question in relation to healthcare services for trans people, it is a devolved matter. It is within the gift of our own assembly as to how our health services are planned for, how they are resourced, and how they're delivered. I think COVID, and even before COVID, we've got to recognise that waiting lists have become just shocking for absolutely every aspect of healthcare. But everyone, no matter how small the numbers of people who might be affected by something, have an entitlement and an expectation to be able to get the treatment that they need. I think there's a wider issue than just making sure that it's dealt with on a primary care level and that it's not in mental health. The reality of it is, by failing to deliver the service for people who desperately need it and make them wait 5 years, they end up needing mental health care. And that's the very sad reality. I think if we look at the number of our young people who self-harm, suicide rates, is it any wonder? And I think we as a society should be ashamed looking back at what we are doing to young people who are going through such trauma. No one goes through the idea of trans or transitioning or gender reassignment without a deep amount of trauma, inward thinking, puzzlement, confusion, stress, strain. It's unbearable for those young people. I think moving forward, we need to make sure that whatever action plan, whatever strategy is going to be adopted by those on the Hill, the reality of it is it needs to be joined up. It needs to be adequately resourced. It needs to stop punishing people because they fall into this category. I look at it from a slightly different perspective, and that's in terms of equality legislation and trying to help people who are being discriminated against. The reality is, if you have someone sitting waiting for 5 years for an initial appointment, and then our legislation requires them to live in that new gender for 2 years, their 7 years have gone by in someone's life before they're able to really move on. It's wrong, and we as a society should be ashamed. And I think it leads into a whole range of other issues, and including conversion therapies and everything else. And that in itself is a minefield that we're promised, a strategy or legislation, and we still sit and we don't have anything. But whatever does come out of this, every single person who needs help deserves help and should get help. The services that are being delivered need to be joined up. It can't be one isolated specialism and then you wait for another couple of years to see some other specialism. They have to be there and they have to follow through. In a former life, I'm sorry for going on about this, this really, really gets to me. In a former life, I was a member of one of the health trust boards. And I was a guardian or a corporate parent for a children's home, and it was for children with special needs. And it broke my heart to see children coming up through that system to have developed relationships with staff, albeit that it was for respite care. And then once they hit 16, they're moved out of the children's services into adult services, and that support isn't there. And I think we need to address that when it comes to trans issues and children who are going through it. You can't just say you've hit 16 or 18 or some random number and say, right, you're into a different process and you're on your own, or you don't have the same support. I think it needs to be, as I keep saying, a joined up, adequately resourced, and a timely quality service that helps everybody.
I've got a microphone for here. I'm conscious we're talking about the trans community. There's no one trans on this panel. So if anyone who's non-binary or trans wants to get involved now, please grab a mic. Go ahead, please. Thank you.
You said that you didn't think the review had been released yet. It was given to the Health Minister in January, and if you would like to read it, I'll give you a copy of it before we leave. It is rubbish. It is going to set trans healthcare, it's not even funny, it's heartbreaking. It is going to send trans healthcare backwards, certainly not forwards, and not in the direction that any of us have fought really, really hard for.
So, it certainly hasn't been released publicly, but one of the things that I feel quite strongly about it, and we'd welcome a copy, is that at the minute you're talking about 1,000 people, and I think if you can't fix a service for that small number of people, then honestly we really do need to go home, because that's a relatively small number of people in Northern Ireland that you should be able to commission and provide a service, and that's a relatively small number of people and families to engage with, so you should be able to deliver it and develop it in a way that actually meets people's needs.
You're not Nicola, right? No, you're not. Nicola Doran should be, thank you. Nicola Doran should be here, who's the director of Mermaids UK in Northern Ireland. Nicola, let's get you a mic.
Thank you.
Hi, Nicola.
I'd just like to ask the panel, what confidence do you have in the current Gender Services Review? And do you feel that our current health service has the expertise and credibility necessary to develop a service that can be welcomed as a model of best practice?
Gender Services Review. Deirdre.
Well, I think what you can hear there, I mean, there's more work to be done, partly in terms of legislation, partly in culture, but also partly in terms of political views and ideological views to these types of issues. And often you'll find that that's where the blockage or the resistance is, that you need to overcome, that you need to challenge, that you need to push back against, that you actually need to use legislation to protect against as well. And it is one of the issues, again, as I say, that has come up in the co-design work with the LGBTQI+ strategy, in terms of a lot of these issues, whether it's within healthcare, whether it's within education, whether it's within the delivery of other services as well, where there is a block, whether it's political, whether it's cultural, or whether it's in the absence of legislation as well. And as I said earlier, part of our legislation is outdated. We obviously have a healthcare system that is in crisis, that we do need to fix, that we do need to invest in. But to do that, we also need to ensure then that the services are being delivered for those who need them. And as was said there, if it is a service of 1,000 people, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, that's not a big number of people. So you have to ask then, where is the block in terms of bringing a service like that forward? And it's not just within the LGBT community. I've seen this in terms of gender as well, in terms of other issues as well, as I say, in language, but also in social class. And we'll have to continue to push back against those blockages. We'll have to continue to expose those blockages and to continue to try and have politics that actually wants to deliver on the basis of rights and equality for all. And I think that's where the focus needs to be. But just in reflecting in some of the conversation and what we're hearing, there's no doubt it's the absence of legislation, or it's not robust enough. There's the culture, which is a huge piece, which directs society. It's systemic within institutions also, but it's also the politics and what ideologically is being driven or being blocked then in terms of progressive legislation or policies coming forward. And we need to be looking at all of that as well, and obviously looking at the legal route in terms of the campaign and activism by way of challenging some of these behaviours or blockages.
The legal route, no disrespect, but I find that kind of frustrating, because the Equality Commission for more years than you would like to remember have been advocating and pleading for reform of legislation. In 2008, they put forward a whole raft of recommendations in terms of how legislation needed to change, particularly so around the introduction of the Equality Act in 2010 across GB, and we got nothing. And every time there's a programme for government, we advocate and provide papers and recommendations for legislative reform on a whole range of issues, not just on LGBT+ issues. It could be on age discrimination, it could be on education, it could be race, all of those issues. and nothing ever happens. It gets to a point where there's maybe a commitment in the programme for government. We might even get to a consultation, and then they don't agree, and then it stops, and then it goes on to the back burner. And every time I have raised that with First and Deputy First Ministers since I took up my tenure 2 years ago, I've been told, oh, we still have policy differences that we need to discuss and thrash out. It's time that, you know, elections and voting are in the hands of the constituents in Northern Ireland. I am not being critical of one party more than another. Maybe we all should be asking questions directly of those who come and knock on our doors. What are you going to do on these issues? And have those answers. But Northern Ireland is Northern Ireland, and we vote on party lines, and we vote on issues that really don't impact on everybody's everyday lives in certain groups. So maybe that's something that you have in your hands to deal with, rather than being critical of a particular party. And I'm not picking on a party.
Well,
I'm saying that you have it in your
the
hands to
Equality
vote.
Commission can bring cases. You can go
We
to
do.
court. You've
We
gone
do
to
bring
court
cases.
a number of times recently, quite famously. The Human Rights Commission has gone to court. The courts are meant to be checks on legislators as well. Do you think there is space for court action, Alyson, in this area of trans healthcare and giving people rights, maybe particular article protections on human rights?
At some point, yes. We don't have the legislation to work with yet, and we don't have the internationally recognized standards to work with. But I still think it's a much more fundamental issue here, and it's whether or not we care enough people care enough to do something. It's about how you approach it. We're talking about this as a policy difference. We're talking about this as an issue. This is about human beings who are being are having less access to human rights. And until we acknowledge that, this is almost a political discussion, and it shouldn't be a political discussion about individual people who happen to be gay or non-binary or trans. And that this is what frustrates me. We're jumping in to talk about legislation or otherwise. What we need to be talking about, being honest with each other and saying, are we a society that cares enough?
Well, this is the 40th anniversary of 2022 is the 40th anniversary of the Dudgeon v UK case, where you go to the European courts and then changes happen here. And is there a European case down the line
Litigation
somewhere?
law can be brilliant if it's really well focused. It's at the right time. You've got the right legislative framework to work with. You've got the resources to go right the way through to the Supreme Court and then the European Court if necessary. But law doesn't change an awful lot. There are some significant cases you've referred to, and they were cases that were begging to happen at that particular time, and thank God for them. Thank God for Jeffrey Dudgeon, for example, bringing that case. But I don't know that a case is, what difference is a case going to make here? What is the question we're even asking a court? Because what you're really saying, what I'm hearing from you is that we are not being treated with dignity and respect. We are still being talked about as if we're an issue, we're a policy issue. And you're not simply looking at us as human beings who are not having all of their rights enjoyed. So I don't know what we'd go to a court with.
I would have thought you could find get yourself a barrister who can find an article that's being challenged in the Human Rights Act. You know, the family life article or
piece by piece you could, but the law hasn't caught up yet.
Okay.
You have to be realistic about it. I'm not giving people false hope.
Karen. Thank you very much.
Thanks, William. I've been listening very patiently to the debate this evening, and I just want to pick up on a few points as points of information. Geraldine's quite right. She raised the Equality Act 2010, which I don't think was ever implemented here in Northern Ireland, and that's where GB changed their policy to take trans healthcare out of being a mental health issue to being in other issues, and to get proper care. And I think that's one of the things that we're frustrated in the trans community, is that we don't have that in place. And that's the article that really means we still have to go through the mental health care. Again, we talked about the timescale of 5 years maybe to get to see your first appointment. That's only your first appointment. You then have to go through the process in that clinic and live in your true life experience for at least another 2. After that, you then have to be recommended for surgery. So you don't get surgery the next day. That, again, is another year or so of a process to get there. And after 9 or 10 years, The survey that Pride and Rainbow carried out identified that trans people are the ones that are most vulnerable and feeling most suicidal. And out of the 1,000 people that I think Margaret mentioned, they won't all be here after that time period, and that's where we really need to do something. Picking up on the gender recognition certificate, I'm trying to get a mortgage. I'm a trans person. I've had to go through a process to get my birth certificate changed. I had to go to a court in England. I didn't need one referral from a psychologist, I needed two. So I had to pay twice to go and get that done after going through a process here in Belfast. My understanding at the minute, we've got one part-time person working in trans healthcare capable of doing this in Northern Ireland. Is that really enough?
Wow.
So I think the answer to the question is the review good enough? Would seem to me to be clearly no.
I don't know if that's the question, though. I mean,
no, the question is, are we providing proper healthcare support recognition?
No, but you're all agreed on that. I mean, aspirational progressiveness isn't the question, right? You all agree that this isn't right and this shouldn't be happening. The real question is what you can do about it to change it. And I'm not hearing too many answers.
So I'm always reluctant.
So yes, let's have another report.
We do an investigation, and Deirdre can speak to this a bit, because we did an investigation into PIP, and we make a set of recommendations, but I can't enforce those. It is 9 times out of 10 people accept Ombudsman recommendations, but I cannot absolutely enforce them. But you may get more progress slightly more quickly, I think, and I am all for legal routes as and when we can use them, but sometimes that's a very long process. And I'm happy to give a commitment to meet with people and to look at where we are on that, and to actually sit down with you and to get the team who are looking at the scoping.
Simon, when you were mentioning earlier how you've taken steps forward in terms of representation within the PSNI. Do you have any idea how many trans officers you have?
I've not got the figures in front of me today, but I can certainly go and...
No, I'm not. I'm just saying, you do have trans officers, I assume.
We will do, but one of the issues that people will recognise here, that we struggle to get people to actually declare their gender or their sexuality. So the figures you can quote, I don't think would necessarily always reflect people's view of their gender. So that I haven't got the figures in front of me tonight.
What have you done to accommodate people who are on a gender journey? People who are making a transition, for example, while they're police officers?
Well, we have a transitioning policy which we signed off last autumn. We consulted on it wisely, and it tried to reflect on some of the sort of the journey that we described about today, and it will set out sort of individual, line managed and corporate responsibilities to reflect people that were in that process. So we signed it off last September.
And we were talking about, some people mentioned conversion therapy, and I got the impression that some of you wanted to make a clear statement that you think that should change. You already had a vote in the Assembly, but that's not become a law yet. In England, as you know, they're splitting the sexuality and gender dimensions of that as they take that through the Commons eventually. If there were to be a law criminalizing conversion therapy, are you confident as the Chief Constable that that law would be enforceable?
Well, that's a fundamental question that goes back to, I suppose, how Alyson talked to something before. It's about how the law is drafted in its first place and its purpose, because as people will know, laws just don't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah.
So there would have to be a clear rationale for that, so that ultimately our job as the police service is to reflect the laws in being at the time. And I think it'd be premature to start to give judgments about the rights and wrongs until you saw what that was.
But when you've thought this through, I'm sure we have these laws in other jurisdictions already.
Yes.
I'm sure in terms of the policing reflection on this across the UK, you're aware of where the pitfalls might be, where the worries might be, the concerns might be. In order to answer the question, do you think it could be enforceable?
Well, I think there's two questions, isn't it? could it be and should it be? Because, I mean, and they're the bits where we get trapped in that there's a moral question here and then there's a practical question. And I think the first thing you start with is what is the process that gets the law into being in the first place, whether it's a devolved matter or something from UK government, and then the part of policing and legitimately enforcing that law to a standard that gets you into a court if that was the case that the society that passed the law wanted.
Deirdre?
Yeah, well, I've policy responsibility for looking at the ban on conversion therapy and bringing it forward, and we should prohibit it first and foremost. It should become legislation for it to be enforced. And I think what was highlighted when we started to look at this within the last mandate was that it is a complex issue, that there's not enough research known as to how wide scale it is here, and indeed what forms or what names that takes up. So if you're going to prohibit something and you're going to prescribe it within legislation, you need to make sure that you have that research and that ground and basis covered. So what we've done within the last year, we've obviously been working with LGBT community and with key organisations that represent that community. We have formed a working group and we did an open call tender for that piece of research to be conducted. And I felt that it was important that that was done by the community themselves, because they obviously can connect with individuals on the ground that have been through this horrendous experience, and can also look at the medical end of things as well. And obviously we have engaged with a number of organisations that have that experience. There was 4 LGBTQI plus organisations that did a combined bid, and they're now carrying out that piece of research, working with Queen's and Ulster universities. We are hoping that that will be concluded over the next short period. And in the meantime, what we have actually done is got some departmental solicitors' advice looking at what the potential barriers or concerns will be when you start to draft that legislation. So creating a foreign policy basis for banning this type of practice and so-called therapy is important, and that's what we're doing now. And then obviously starting to look at robust legislation and starting to formulate that. What I've given a commitment to is that we will co-design that with the LGBTQI plus community in the time ahead to make sure that it is robust and to make sure that it will stand up for scrutiny within the chamber and with any organisations, because there's no doubt, like other pieces of equality legislation, this will be challenged. There will be attempts to block it, there will be attempts to roll back and to chip away at the legislation that will be presented. It could be blocked at an executive, just the way welfare mitigations were blocked for 2 years until we tried to find a way around having those mitigations then brought through onto the assembly floor. So that's why we're making sure that we're taking the time, and I know it is causing a frustration within the community. I've met a number of political parties over the last year and a half, and indeed I've engaged with the community as well. But I want to make sure when I'm bringing forward this legislation that it is robust, that it's actually meeting the need out on the ground, not just in the here and now, but trying to have a sense of what that could look like over the next period of time, to make sure that when we are prohibiting something, then the police or other agencies in terms of enforcing have clear legal duties of what it is they need to be doing and what it is they need to be enforcing.
Otherwise you've no idea what the elements of the crime were and how the police would even detect it.
So we're going to continue to work in that co-design. We're going to continue to meet the key organisations as we start to draft this legislation going forward, and obviously with the Human Rights and Equality Commission and others to make sure that this is robust. We're obviously continuing to engage with the south of Ireland who are trying to bring this through the Shannon, because we have to make sure we're an island where people pass through on a regular basis, that we're taking an island-wide approach, but also that we're looking across the water in terms of Scotland and the work that they're doing, and of course the regressive step that Westminster done to ensure that our legislation does not follow that regressive step that they took in the last while.
Can I just say I've just been given the very sad news that David Tremble has passed away. David Tremble obviously was the first minister after the creation of the new Assembly with the Good Friday Agreement, was a significant architect of the Good Friday Agreement. Next year is the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and those of us who lived through the Troubles know how our lives changed so dramatically during that time, and through the courageous actions of many people who made decisions to move us into a very different place. And the LGBT community changed in terms of its experience of life here too, as a consequence of the human rights transformation, the values transformation, the inclusivity transformation that has taken place. So I think we should just note that David Tremble played a very significant role in our story and all of our stories. Some of us knew him, some of us knew him very well, and even across the political spectrum, he carried immense respect. Just in the last few weeks, Queen's University just unveiled a wonderful new portrait of David Tremble, which will hang in the Great Hall at Queen's as one of the Nobel laureates from Queen's University. So we note that tonight. Would anyone like to comment, Deirdre, on that news, that very sad news that we've just received?
Shocked as I heard it. I didn't think he was that ill. And obviously condolences to Daphne and his entire family. Condolences to the Ulster Unionists, and I know there's some Julianne and co, I'm sure, are feeling it now within the Ulster Unionist Party. And obviously, as you say, there's probably a generation of that generation that are now beginning to pass away.
Right.
In terms of I was 18 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Back in April, I turned 18 that month. And obviously, you could see the stresses that brought to David Tremble as well, in terms of the skirmishes with other parties also. And I suppose he showed leadership, working with John Hume and with others at that time in terms of bringing forward the Good Friday Agreement, which you're saying we're going to mark in the next year in terms of 25 years. And a generation that has grown up with relative peace out on the ground. I've been an interface worker working in some of the most contentious areas of Belfast, and over that time we have seen a complete transformation in terms of face-to-face conflict and fighting. And it's obviously in large part down to the politics and making politics work, the activism out on the ground, making sure the communities are working together as well. And obviously people like David Irvine and others who made a huge contribution. So, just sincere condolences to his wife, his family, who must really be feeling it, the Ulster Unionist Party and, his wider friends and, I suppose, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. I really appreciate that. I want to give you a chance on any of the issues we haven't mentioned yet about services, your experience within the LGBTQ community in Northern Ireland, a question you think should be asked but hasn't been asked yet. Karen will come to you next with the mic, then we'll come to you, and then we'll come to anybody over here. Very quiet side of the room over here, apart from Vince Creelan. Vince, I'm going to come back to you in a second. Go ahead, Karen.
I think just when you give me the opportunity to come back, I really have a question for Deirdre. Given the good work that John Hume, David Tremble and some of our predecessors did, we're 25 years on. We're sitting here today with no legislative assembly. The debate tonight is about policy focus. In order to get policy in place, we need to have a legislative assembly in place to pass that policy. What can we do to get our politicians back around the table? Is the SDLP doing the right thing next week and trying to form an opposition and bring something back? Or what else do we need to do?
Well, you got the recall tomorrow at the Assembly.
Well, I think it was inevitable what the SDLP were going to do because they didn't have a seat in an incoming executive because of the election results back in May. I think it's awful that we don't have an executive, and I think things are really going to begin to bite over the next month or two. I do believe that you're going to see a manifestation of that anger out on the streets. Because those pressures are beginning to build. Over the last couple of months, I've been out and about across the north meeting community organisations at the grassroots, and people are really struggling. Organisations are struggling to stay afloat because of the rising cost and living for everybody and the knock-on effect that has for community services, to keep their community buildings open as well, because obviously they're feeling those cost pressures. And we have a pot of money there within the executive that we could allocate. It's not going to relieve all of the pressure, but it would go some way. And I think when the electorate spoke in May and reflecting on obviously the death of David Tremble, politics has to be seen to be working. I got involved. I'm a community activist by background. That's what I've done my whole life. I kind of fell into politics, but I went into it to deliver, to make sure that I could see a qualitative difference for communities that I came from, working class communities, and delivering for all people. And so I want to be in there doing a job, making sure that I have a budget, making sure that I can make policy decisions and bring legislation forward. And we can't do that now without an executive. We can't even do it if they nominate a speaker because the executive still doesn't function. So we can't bring forward legislation unless it's through private members' bills. So there are still going to be restrictions. So we do need to have clear focus. We need to, I think part of the concern is because of the issues that have been going on within Westminster, the British government aren't focused in terms of the peace process and the politics of here. There's obviously friction between the British and Irish governments as well, who are co-guarantors of our Good Friday Peace Agreement. And I think there has to be a refocus from those, but certainly from all of the political parties. And I think that agitation and demand from communities out on the ground will start to build over the next period, because as I say, people are really struggling now. And we were elected to get in around the table and do a job for people. And that's what I want to get stuck in to do in the next period, sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Karen. We've got another microphone there. Can I go to Mal first? Because, well, and I'll come back to you, give you a second go. Over here. Mal's got his hand in the air.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, I'm really glad to hear the policy focus tonight. I've been on the other side of that, and my frustration is it's platitudes year on year on year. We knew about trans healthcare 6 years ago. What has moved? Nothing. And that's the frustration I think you'll feel from the community tonight. And I appreciate the blocker with the DUP, but I think the challenge must be put to the Minister for Communities. Your department has had policy responsibility for sexual orientation and gender since 2016, but you provide zero core funding to any of the queer groups. You've also said in response to Assembly questions that it will be up to each individual minister about whether or not he or she chooses to put money into any emerging LGBTQ strategy. Are we not being set up for another failure? Because if there's no executive, the strategy can't go for approval, which means it can't come out for consultation, and it was promised to be out by December 21. Are we just going to be back here next year, hearing the same platitudes, blaming the DUP, and no movement? And I think the challenge to you, Minister, is to fund queer organisations, not through arm's length bodies, directly from your department.
Deirdre.
Well, I think firstly I came into post-Mal, as you'll know. I left Belfast City Council in January 2020. So I became an Assembly member and a minister within that week. And obviously part of my early engagement was to ensure that we brought forward the social inclusion strategies. So the LGBTQI+, the anti-poverty, the gender and the disability. And I wanted to make sure I could have brought strategies forward, just devising them within the department, but I thought that that was the wrong thing to do. What I wanted to do was to ensure that we were co-designing those strategies with the communities and with stakeholders that are mostly impacted and affected by them as well. So we sat around a co-design process, and that's the process that we're in the middle of in terms of a strategy. A commitment that I can give that strategy will be ready for an incoming executive, that will be presented to the incoming executive, and that strategy will be costed in terms of the co-design work that has been done with departments. The reality and what I'm pointing to within questions in terms of the question that you've responded, it's for each minister to determine how their department is run and what they prioritise. But notwithstanding that, if the strategy is signed off by an executive, if it's contained within the programme for government, then it's a cross-cutting strategy that needs to be delivered upon. So that's the critical part. And what I've said to the co-design group is, because I'm in as an interim minister at the moment, we don't know what a future executive will be made up of, but that they should have the opportunity to present their strategies and their proposals from the co-design groups to that incoming executive going forward, and to make sure that we get the strategy approved and that we get it out the door for consultation as soon as possible. I've also put funding, as I've said, in terms of the consortium bit of LGBT groups in terms of doing the conversion piece of legislation. And then there are other areas of work. Traditionally within the Department of Communities, funding has went out to community organisations on a geographical basis. So that is about meeting the needs of communities and how those communities are made up on class, on gender, on sexual orientation and all. It's about delivering that across the board on a geographical basis. I think what the strategies have brought forward is that we need to do that in some ways in terms of the issues, but we also need to be focused on the categorisation of issues as well. So what I have instructed in terms of our regional grant-making programme is that we're now doing a review of that. We're looking at those programmes and we're actively reviewing them at the minute, taking into account those 4 inclusion strategies. So LGBT, gender, poverty in terms of social class as well, and also disability, and how we then start to reorientate our funding going forward. And that also includes, urban and rural policy to make sure that we're rural proofing as well. So it's not good enough that there's no central pot of funding across any executive departments for LGBTQ organisations. I'd met with Carvery just before the election where their funding was running out. Unfortunately, they couldn't get funding at that point. It was late. We didn't have an executive in terms of a new budget at that point. But going forward, I have a commitment I have led on that review within my department, and I know coming from the policy that the strategy coming forward will only work if there's a resource attached to it. And that's one of the focuses that we're putting in and that I will be presenting, or at least leaving an instruction for the incoming executive going forward. So again, happy to update the Greens, any other party, or indeed any LGBT individual or community organisation that's here tonight. Happy to do direct meetings with people as well on this.
Thank you very much. Cleverly reminding the audience he's the deputy leader of the Green Party asking that question. Down here. And then I think one more question. If there's anybody else in the room, think of it now. No, coming to you, yes. Oh, 2. I'll take 2. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to recap a little bit on trans healthcare. I think the elephant in the room for me is around the credibility of the health service and the expertise of the health service. I mean, over the years, we have had numerous reports of extremely negative experiences of service users who have been given wrong information, who have experienced barriers to services where barriers didn't have to be there, who have been directed in the wrong direction, and yet there doesn't seem to be any consequences to this. We're talking about no trans healthcare being available, but that's not strictly true. You can access trans healthcare if you can afford to pay for it. So even with the legislation, the policy and the cultural attitudes that we have, there is healthcare available if you can afford to pay for it. And I just wonder if the panel know, and if this is true and right, but it is happening, that service users who are accessing private healthcare are being told by service providers that they won't be able to return into gender services if they access private healthcare. Now, that doesn't sound to me as though it's legal or right, and I think it's something that really has to be addressed. We also have to look at the fact that our health service providers were very quick to quote the Bell Tavistock case and very, very quick to start looking as though they were acting on that. And yet when you ask them about the parental consent case, there was absolute silence, and it basically reversed the Bell Tavistock, the impact of that. So, I mean, we talk about cultural attitudes, and I know there's a lot of work being done, and it's great to hear such passionate voices on the panel talking about what you want to do to make change. But there is, intrinsic issues within the health service in terms of who provides the health services. And there's a lot of areas where it's very hard to tell, is it a lack of cultural competence or is it transphobia? And what happens if it's either of those things? How do you correct it? And what's going to happen about it?
Thank you very much. 2 more, one over there. I think there was a hand. Yes, there was a hand over there. And then we'll come back to you. Yeah, right over there.
Thank you.
No, on this side. I'm sorry, just on this side over here. Yes.
Yeah, no,
right over.
Or some there.
Right. Oh, you've got the mic already.
got
I
my-
am so sorry. Go right ahead. Yes. I was so keen to get this side of the room represented because they've been dwarfed by this side of the room. Go ahead.
Thank you to all of the panel, and thank you for your honesty. You've each said culture a number of times, and we have so many routes and implementation, but already people are saying in education and health and welfare that they can't actually use those routes for fear of intimidation. It's only through advocates like the Rainbow Project, where Alyson and I were talking today, that they only feel comfortable in their own safe space. How are we going to address culture so that those routes actually can be enacted and the statistics can be properly analysed? Because right now we're under-reporting too much.
Right, thank you. Anyone want to address that on the culture?
I think it goes back to education. You know, not just education in a school setting, but it's raising awareness. We talked about harassment, homophobia, transphobia. It's about raising awareness and informing people and making them comfortable with something different than what they're used to. And I think it's as fundamentally basic as that. And it starts in our communities, it starts in our schools, and it must actually have an impact in our health service as well. So whatever services is going to be designed, it has to be delivered by people who are professional, who are expert in the field, and it must be adequately resourced so there's a quality service that people can have faith in it. Now, as an Equality Commission, we are currently supporting a couple of cases in relation to transgender issues and the whole healthcare service. And it's only the tip of the iceberg, we know that. But we can only act on the cases that come before us. And as I said earlier on in the evening, if you are aware of something, please come and talk to our advice officers, because it's only by taking those cases that the law can be tested, that we can build up the evidence for changes to the legislation. So we have to work in partnership. And that partnership isn't just on these issues, it's right through every tentacle of our society.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have our final question. No pressure on you
no
at all, by the way.
No pressure, not at all. Thanks, William. Thank you to the panel. I think it's quite clear from the room today how frustrated we are because we're being denied rights. We're not up for debate. We're not an ideology. We're human beings. And we are sick, sore and tired of, yes, we know, yes, we understand. We have been saying these things for years and we're seeing no action. We've been waiting 13 years for the sexual orientation strategy. We're working quite closely with Deirdre and her department in regards to that. But there's work to be done in other organisations and organisations that are represented here tonight. But to close, my question is about Belfast Pride. Belfast Pride gets less than 20% of its funding from the local government, and the rest is self-raised through sponsorship and fees. Why do statutory agencies and government talk about supporting Pride, but fail to invest in Pride as something that gives so much to our city and was described by our Lord Mayor as a gift to the city? So why are you not investing in Pride, and why are you not investing in LGBTQI services?
Oh. I think you probably answered that one already for your department. Deirdre's already spoken about how her department funds things, and she's a former Lord Mayor, of course. I mentioned that too. So I'll start over here. Are you allowed to fund things?
We work in partnership with organisations.
You could fund, you've got a checkbook.
I don't have a checkbook. I don't even have a personal checkbook.
You've got an electronic banking. What can you do?
We have a very, very small budget that would help us support organisations. And we've been working in partnership with Pride since over 20 years.
Yeah.
Since it started. And we value that partnership. I'd love to have a funding pot that I could support groups. There would be a whole range of organisations that would come looking for funding. But we don't have it. We constantly go hand in cap to TEO and beg for money because it's through legal funding cases that we can get media coverage from. That informs wider society.
You have statutory limitations on how you can spend money. Local government, for example, councils can do other things, can't they, Deirdre? You've got more freedom.
Yeah, they would have more freedom, and I know from my department, I mean, we would put money into local councils in terms of festivals and community grant programmes. There could also be issues that we could fund depending on if we have the resources available. There's probably a broader issue in terms of funding for the LGBTQI plus community more broadly, because unless they're getting, I suppose, charity funding from elsewhere, there's no kind of central government pot that they can go into. So that's some of the stuff that I'm starting to look at, certainly from a community and voluntary sector organisation response in terms of supporting that key community infrastructure within communities. But we also need to be looking at that by way of tourism NI. We need to be looking at that by way of regeneration programmes. We do commit some funding, or have done in the past, in Pride through the Belfast City Centre initiatives. But again, I mean, I'm more than willing to engage and talk to Pride in terms of the funding. It's something I did work with them on when I was in Belfast City Council, so happy to pick that up again. But there is that broader issue which is contained within the LGBTQI+ strategy around funding and resourcing of a strategy going forward that we do need to fix. There's no doubt about that. We have gender funding within my department, for example, in terms of women's centres and organisations. Health department have certain commissioning of services as well. So we need to look at that across the board, and it's one of the key areas within the strategy. But I've already started work in terms of reviewing that policy. So happy to have a conversation in terms of the Pride Festival, or festivals, because Belfast isn't the only one. There's Newry and Derry and other places as well. So happy to have that more strategic discussion.
Margaret's got 4 staff members, so she just needs money to get more.
I can't, unfortunately,
No,
cannot
do you have a
fund.
checkbook?
Can I say something?
You do have a checkbook, do you?
Yeah, but I can't, well, I can't, there's nothing in the bank to write the check. But what I would, and we are prevented from contributing to groups.
Okay.
What I would say is, and I've heard really clearly tonight, we can give in kind, which is in our time and effort, and this has got to be put back up the priority list, because we can be changing the mindset of other people, and we've got to do it. And I don't want to be back here next year. This is my first time here. I've been in this job 9 months. It's already too long. We should have prioritised it more. And I'm hearing that very clearly. But so we can give. We can give. All of us can
all
give.
kinds of ways. Yes.
It doesn't have to be money. In fact, money is probably the least of it.
Yeah.
We need to be changing mindset so people care enough to be giving you money. So that's all I can do, is try and promise to do that.
Simon, in terms of police, you mean you've got investment in local communities, public safety investment, all kinds of things. You've got a big checkbook, haven't you?
Well, again, probably like I have to work within certain financial rules. I think there is commitment, as Alyson said, around time, energy. I think the unique thing we're doing this year is part of the Pride Week. We're hosting policing's first LGBT conference here in Belfast. First time we've hosted it. So we've got delegates from all over the country coming on Friday to what promises to be quite a wide range in discussion. It'll touch on some, if not all, of the issues that we've raised today. So and we have supported that conference, so that there are things we can demonstrate we are doing. And also, obviously, there's Pride as the event itself, but a bit like many of the delegates have said here, there's all the stuff that takes place out with the Pride event, where all of us, I think you've heard today, and I don't want to speak for others, but the thing, like Alyson, been listening and reflecting, is our commitment to do all we can where we have relevant purchase to move some of these issues on. So it's not just talking, it's doing.
I'm conscious that the millennials in the room are on Instagram right now wondering what a checkbook is. So we probably need to come to the end of the evening. We are at the end of the evening. They have been wonderful, haven't they? They've been very honest and very supportive in their comments. I really appreciate it. Got a final question, and this just is a question to take you to the bar, and it's about queer heroes. It's about the people from the LGBTQ plus world, living or dead. Maybe someone you know, a family member, someone you've read, a hero, that you would lift up and say, that I find that person inspiring. Simon, who would it be for you?
Well, I think he's just recently retired from policing. That's all right. He's recently retired from policing. Someone I met sort of 10 years ago when I was in a senior role in London, called Adrian Hanstock. He became the most senior sort of gay officer in the police service. And he was somebody that was, to me, was very open about the story of his life when he's joined the police service as a clerk, in actual fact, on the police staff side, became an officer and rose through the ranks. So he was somebody who's both lived experience with his partner and also his professional experience left a profound impact on me.
Thank you very much. That's a great choice, great pick. Geraldine.
I said earlier about the Commission relies very heavily on people who have the courage to come to us for advice and take cases, because they are instrumental in informing wider society, informing people about their rights. So it would be wrong to pick someone different than someone who had the courage to stand up like that. And the person I would probably refer to would be Christine Goodwin. She died in 2014. But she was the person who transitioned from being husband and father and became a woman and fought very hard for her rights, the right to access her pension, the right to marry. And it was through her efforts that in 2004, the Gender Recognition Act came about. So I think she was a very, very courageous woman, and she could teach a lot of people in our society today an awful lot of things.
Great pick. Well done. Yours? Deirdre.
I thought of this question in the personal, so people who have, that I know and have been impacted. So, and I was nearly going to say, well, Mary Ellen Campbell, who was a Sinn Féin councillor in Belfast and the first person to have, I suppose, a deputy mayor title that was out and open. And I think she really influenced me, but she's Sinn Féin, so I didn't want to then pick her. Or
Pick a Green Party member.
Favoritism.
No.
Love modest jackets. But
yeah, that's about as far as it goes. I know.
When I thought about it, was Mary Query, who's somebody that I would know well. And Mary would have been, and I love her because she interconnects across a variety of different groupings and campaigns and agitators. So in terms of her broad community activism, be it out on the ground over the last couple of decades, working in working class communities, looking at issues around deprivation, obviously within the LGBT community and our campaigning and activism there, but also as a woman as well in terms of gender. And Mary's always somebody, she's very, gently spoken, very light, but she can be very ferocious in terms of getting her point across as well. And what I loved about her was, the community I come from in the market decided a couple of years to start having Pride Nights as part of their local community festival. And Mary was there right away, willing to give a hand. She was able to pull in a whole panel of speakers, and she still phones every year to make sure, firstly, that we're doing the night, but secondly, to make sure that we do have people or a discussion panel there. And I just thought that even though she was there on the first year, she still touches base every year. She's just somebody that I can see that I have huge respect for, that I really value. She hasn't just been doing this for a couple of years. It's been a life of struggle, and that's something I hugely admire and respect.
Terrific pick. Thank you. Margaret.
So I actually have two, sorry. So one is, before I came to this role, I was Director of MenCap in Northern Ireland, so children and adults with learning disabilities. And my colleague in Wales is a man called William Crocker, who's out and proud. But he was wonderful at recognising that no matter what sector of society you look at, you also have an LGBTQ community there. And he worked with an amazing group of young adults who had Down syndrome, who formed the group Drag Syndrome. And they were an absolute joy. And the only person I know who could have got a big organisation like MenCap to support that is Wayne. One of my other loves is actually poetry, and Carol Ann Duffy is someone I love very much. So that's my other person, very personal.
Brilliant. Thank you. Alyson. These have been fantastic choices so far. Alyson.
I'm actually really torn. One very obvious one for me, but it might be too obvious, would be James Baldwin, the black, gay American writer, who I just love everything he writes. I love listening to him. Yeah. I believe everything he says. But also,
it sounds like it.
He's just a remarkable human being.
Millennials can find him on YouTube.
Go and look him up. It's
He'll always be there.
Invest some time in reading some of his work. But then the other person would probably be a woman who's no longer with me, who was a very good friend of mine who trained to be a barrister with me, lesbian woman, who was the bravest, most courageous person I've yet to meet. And we were both in London together. I was scared of my shadow, and she was as brave as in every circumstance. And she died, not, I think, understanding how much of an inspiration she was to people. So I don't believe in a God necessarily, but if there is one up there, and she'll be up there and she'll be listening to this, so I would like to just put one out into the ether for her.
Thank you. That's lovely. Let's thank them all. Our panel, our policy experts for the evening. Thank you very much. And can I ask you to thank our signers who have been here all evening? Yes, thank them. Working hard for us throughout the evening. And if you want to contribute and support Pride, of course, one way you can do that is buy a lanyard now. You're not buying these lanyards, you're investing in these lanyards. And I can tell you they cost £4 each to make, so that is not a donation. That's the baseline. Everything above that is a donation, but you can get a lanyard at the door. Enjoy the drinks. Thank you for being here tonight. Have a great night.